The wind had died, leaving behind only the rustle of dry pine needles brushing against ancient rock. Above Clearwater Ridge, the sun sank low, casting a deep orange glow over the jagged silhouettes of the highlands. The air was thin and still, almost as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. No sound of birds, no hum of insects, just the eerie, absolute quiet of something gone very wrong. Hanging from the edge of a crumbling cliff, a young girl struggled to keep her head upright. Her small body swayed with the windless air, suspended by a frayed rope tied cruelly tight around her waist. Her arms were pinned behind her back, wrists raw beneath the plastic zip ties. Her breath came in shallow pulls, eyes wide but fading. Ella Porter, 8 years old, barely conscious, hung above a death drop that stretched at least 100 feet down. Below her, sharp shale jutted out like the teeth of a waiting monster. Her sneakers had lost grip long ago. Classmates had spiraled into chaos when she chased a lizard too deep into the brush. She remembered turning around and seeing nothing familiar. No footprints, no markers, just the endless forest with shadows growing longer. It was during that panicked search for a trail back that she saw them, men in dark clothes moving through the woods with heavy bags slung over their backs and rifles gripped in gloved hands. She'd crouched behind a rock, watched them bury something, near an old ranger's cabin, and before she could slip away, one of them turned. He saw her. The rest happened fast. Rough hands, a rag over her mouth, voices sharp with panic. She saw too much. Leave no trail. They hadn't wanted to kill her. Not outright. Too risky. But they could disappear her. Leave her hanging here in the cold, in the silence where no one would think to look. They figured time would do the rest. Ella's eyes blinked slow, like closing, shutters on a dying light. Her head slumped forward, chin brushing her chest. Blood crusted near her temple where she'd hit her head. The rope dug deeper with every unconscious twitch. Then the silence shifted. From the tree line above, a dark shape emerged. It moved like smoke, low and careful, almost soundless. At first glance, it could have been a shadow cast by the dying sun. But then it moved again, slinking toward the edge of the cliff. And in that motion was a grace, not human, not deer, not bear. It was a wolf. Thick black fur streaked with old ash gray, lean but powerful. Its amber eyes locked onto the figure hanging over the edge. For a long breath, it didn't move, just stared. Then, as if pulled by something older than instinct, it padded forward, nose twitching as it took in the scent. Blood, fear, human. Ash had once had another name, a tag, a handler, a past. But that was 3 years and a world ago. Now he lived with the ghosts of fire, deep in the mountains, where no trail led and no collar reached. Most days he kept to himself, watching the world from the shadows. But something about this night pulled him closer. Something about the way the girl's breath caught, the way her heartbeat trembled in the air. Ash stepped closer to the ledge. The wind shifted. The smell of old gasoline and boot leather clung faintly to the rope. He growled deep, low, a sound that vibrated through his ribs. His ears twitched. Then he moved. The wolf circled, searching the rocks, sniffing where the rope had been anchored. A plastic stake jammed into a crack near the ledge. A sloppy work. Human panic. Ash leaned forward, sniffed the knot, then gingerly, he bit down. Not to break it, to test it. The weight below shifted. A small, muffled groan rose from the girl. She was still alive. He pulled back, pacing, thinking. The sun had nearly vanished now, leaving the sky a deep, bruised violet. Stars blinked into view. The cold crept in, bringing with it the scent of snow far up the ridge. Ash knew time was bleeding out. If she hung there through the night, her small frame wouldn't last. With a low huff, he returned to the stake and began tugging. Not wildly, not like prey, but with calculated force. The first pull slipped the stake an inch. The second pulled it looser. Dust fell. The rope shifted below. Ella groaned again, legs kicking faintly in the air. Then the stake gave way. Ash bit the rope near the base, and using his weight pulled back hard. The girl's body slid up slow, jerking, but upward. He backed away from the cliff, dragging her inch by inch. Each time he stopped, he'd check the tension, then pull again. When she finally cleared the edge, she crumpled into the pine needles like a discarded doll. Ash sniffed her, checked her breathing, faint, but there. He curled around her small body, not touching, just near, guarding. The stars spun above, the wind carried no sound. Ash didn't sleep. He lay there, eyes open, watching the shadows crawl across the forest. Somewhere far below, the men who left her thought they had buried the truth in silence. But Ash had heard, and now silence would answer back. The forest didn't make a sound that morning, as if nature itself had chosen to mourn. In silence, sunlight filtered through the branches in fractured beams, glinting across a stretch of dry stone and dirt where something terrible had nearly ended. The wind moved like breath across the ridge, brushing pine needles in a hush too soft to be comforting, carrying with it the faint traces of blood, frayed rope, and the sharp imprint of panic. The clearing was still, the silence broken only by the shallow rise and fall of a child's chest. Curled beside a patch of boulders at the edge of a cliff, Ella Porter lay motionless. Her frame, slight and trembling, had not moved since the moment the fraying rope snapped free from its anchor. Though her fall had been stopped by luck, or by the angle of the rock catching her weight, what little strength she'd had already left her. Her arms were bruised and lined with red, where the plastic ties had cut too deep, and her cheeks bore scratches from the scramble against stone and bark. Dirt caked her skin and clothes, and her breathing came in thin, uneven pulls, as if her body hadn't decided yet whether to fight on or fade. The wolf found her just after sunrise. He didn't howl or growl. He made no noise at all as he stepped from the timberline, dark paws moving soundlessly over gravel and broken twigs. His coat, once sleek in uniform, was now a tangle of soot-black fur streaked with rough scars, most notably a long, burn-scarred patch that wrapped over his ribs, like a reminder carved in flesh. His eyes, however, remained unclouded, golden, clear, unflinching. He didn't look startled to find her there. He simply stood in place, ears angled forward, gaze fixed on the still child lying just beyond the fallen rope. Long before this moment, he had known captivity. A companion wolf trained by handlers in another life, specialized, refined, and tested in silence. He had spent his earliest years learning the scent of fear and the signals of distress, the tactile precision of search and rescue, the meaning behind different cries, patterns of breath, and how the body folds when hope is leaving. He had been trained not just to track, but to understand. But that had been before the fire. 3 years ago, a blaze had consumed the outpost facility tucked in the northern stretch of Clearwater Ridge. The humans had fled when it turned violent, but the animals had not all been taken. His enclosure, heavy with reinforced bars and bolted locks, had been left behind in the chaos. The flames had come not like a wall, but like a living thing, and in the heat and smoke and screaming metal, the wolf had torn his way out through pain and instinct alone. He had survived, but the world he'd known didn't survive with him. He had walked away, burned, changed, and never once looked back until now. There was something about the girl, not her size or her scent, though both were familiar in the language of instinct, but something deeper. He had watched her from the ridge the night before, seen the way her small form dangled, wrists bound, head bowed, but eyes somehow open, meeting his own across that distance with a calm that should not have existed in a child on the edge of death. That look had reminded him of another place, another moment when one life decided to stand between the void and another. He stepped closer, not quickly, not recklessly, but with a measured tension in every stride, as if the moment demanded reverence. Her body gave no response at first, only a soft shift of air against the dirt as she breathed. Her lips moved faintly, unintelligible, and her fingers twitched once in the dust. He lowered his head, sniffed the faint trail of blood along her wrist and recognized the thin scent of fear, but not fresh, not immediate. Whatever had terrified her had already come and gone. He did not understand mercy the way humans did. He knew survival, instinct, decision. And in the space between action and stillness, something old stirred in the senses of his frame. He lowered, his shoulder beside her, nudging the slack rope, then pressed his body into hers with careful pressure, bracing her as he began to tug the rope gently with his teeth. Each movement was small, cautious, meant not to tear or jolt, but to slide her away from the cliff's edge, inch by inch, foot by foot. At one point she groaned faintly, and the wolf stilled, waiting. When she didn't cry out or shift, he resumed his work. It took longer than instinct would allow. The wild is not patient, but something in him remembered how to be. The girl was no longer in danger of falling, yet he didn't leave her there. He stayed. When the sun climbed high and the air turned sharp with the dryness of midday heat, he moved to her side once more, pressed his flank against her back, and laid his head across his paws. His breathing matched hers, slow, careful, vigilant. He closed his eyes only briefly, ears twitching with every sound. Birds passed overhead, and somewhere far off, the cry of coyotes echoed through the canyons. But none came near. As the sky darkened into deep, dusty orange, the girl stirred. A single word slipped from her parched lips, a breath more than a voice, fragile and hoarse, yet shaped with quiet certainty. Ash. There was no command in the word, no demand, just recognition, like something sacred being given form. The wolf's ears turned at the sound, and though he didn't understand language the way humans did, he felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. The name suited him, drawn from the color of his coat, the lingering scent of burned pine still buried deep in his fur, and the scar that marked him as something changed by fire, but not ended by it. He didn't leave. Through the night, he remained, beside her, not merely as a guardian but as something older than that. Witness, keeper, sentinel. The wind rose and fell through the trees, brushing the branches like fingers against old stone, and somewhere beyond the dark ridge lines, a storm threatened to build. But beneath the pines, in a small clearing stained, with dried blood and something like grace, a child slept and a wolf watched, and between them was a silence no longer empty. She had not died, because he had seen her. The winter sun had barely lifted above the ridge when Nate Callahan stirred from his modest cabin, nestled between the boulders and bramble of Clearwater Ridge. Years had passed since he retired from the Forest Service, yet habits forged in silence and solitude remained firm. He still rose before daylight, still checked the weather by scent and wind, and still believed in trusting what the wild revealed without asking. That morning, however, the frost that clung to his porch railing wasn't the only sign something had changed. Outside, beneath the slanted shadow of pine and rock, a presence stirred that Nate hadn't felt in years. Something that watched, waited, remembered. The black wolf had returned. Ash, as Ella now called him, stood at the edge of the clearing, barely a silhouette between the shifting trees. Nate hadn't seen the creature in over 3 years. Not since a wildfire swept across the lower basin and a joint rescue mission involving both humans and trained animals had gone devastatingly wrong. Ash had been presumed dead. His handler, a blunt, secretive man named Kellen Rohr, had filed a report stating the animal was lost to the blaze and unrecoverable. But Nate had always doubted that. Something about that file never sat right with him. Wolves didn't simply vanish, not those trained with such precision. Not those who moved like shadows and smelled danger like smoke. Now, as the wolf padded silently behind the young girl he had pulled from death, Nate felt the weight of buried questions rising again. Ella, swaddled in one of Nate's oversized flannel jackets, sat cross-legged on the cabin floor beside the small fireplace. Her cheeks, though still pale from exhaustion, held a faint hue of life again. She didn't speak much, but she didn't have to. The story had already begun writing itself in the haunted look in her eyes and the shallow bruises on her wrists. The little girl had spent the night leaning against the animal's side, curled in safety and warmth beneath a thick coat of fur that had once braved battlefields and search missions, and now lay stretched along the hearth, as though guarding her from the ghosts that still lurked just beyond the door. Nate studied Ash with a quiet dread he didn't quite understand. The wolf was different, not just older or scarred, though he bore both in plain view. The left flank had a jagged line of fur that hadn't grown back right. The ridge of skin puckered, in a way that suggested it hadn't been a clean wound. Around his neck, just under the coat, was a faint impression. Not a collar, but something thinner, sharper, something that had once restrained him tightly. The old ranger reached for a worn field journal and began making notes. It wasn't just the wolf's reappearance that nagged at him, but the implication that someone had taken a creature trained for rescue and retasked it for something darker. Something that left scars both seen and unseen. The day passed slow, and Ella slept for most of it. Nate busied himself digging through a rusted filing cabinet, chasing a thread that had long gone cold. Ash watched him, but didn't interfere. As dusk settled and wind picked up across the ridge, Nate finally found what he was looking for. A laminated ID sheet from a handler registry dated 4 years back. The wolf's photo was grainy but unmistakable. Black coat, pale yellow eyes, distinctive notch on the right ear. ID tag, A0142. Assigned handler, RORK. Unit name, Operation Watchtower. But something was wrong. The number listed on the registry didn't match the faint tattoo Nate had glimpsed beneath Ash's fur the night before while tending a shallow scratch. The one inked onto the inner thigh of the animal read a different code, BR076X. Not military, not search and rescue. It was a private tag. Nate exhaled through his teeth. Black Ridge. The name hit like a long-forgotten echo. Years ago, a controversial security firm had attempted to push into wildlife-assisted combat support, blurring the line between canine operations and militarized animal behavior. Public backlash had been swift, especially after leaked footage showed aggressive conditioning methods. The program was shut down, files sealed, and animals reassigned or terminated. But Nate had always suspected some had gone underground. If Ash was one of them, it meant he hadn't just survived a fire. He had survived something far more methodical and far more brutal. The wolf stirred suddenly from his place by the fire, his head lifted, ears twitching toward the window. Nate moved to the side, following his gaze. Down the ridge, headlights flickered. A white SUV crept along the dirt road, its motion deliberate, tires crunching just loud enough to disturb the calm. No plates, tinted glass. The same SUV that had passed the road 2 days prior, just before Ella was found. Ash stood fully now, muscles tight, eyes fixed. His body language had shifted, no longer calm or relaxed. Nate recognized the stance instantly, defensive but not fearful. The wolf wasn't just alert, he was ready. The SUV didn't stop. It rolled past the cabin entrance and down the next turn, disappearing into the mist that clung to the tree line. But the tension didn't fade. That night, Nate triple-locked the door and kept a loaded rifle close by. Ash didn't sleep. He paced the room in slow arcs, circling near the girl, then to the door, then back again. Outside, the wind howled through the broken canyon like the cry of something ancient and patient. Ella stirred once in her sleep, murmuring, something Nate couldn't catch. Ash moved beside her, rested his snout on her arm, and waited. At dawn, Nate made his decision. He picked up the old rotary phone, still wired to a satellite line, one he hadn't used in years, and dialed a number, etched into memory but absent from any book. A line picked up on the third ring. "Delaney," said the voice. "This is Nate Callahan. I think you need to come up to Clearwater Ridge. Bring what you got on Black Ridge." A pause then. "It's about the wolf, and it's not over." Ash, sitting quietly at the window, turned his gaze toward the woods again as if he already knew that whatever had scarred him once was on its way back, and this time it wouldn't stop until it finished the job. Winter had pressed its weight fully over Clearwater Ridge. The trees stood rigid and silent under thin veils of snow, their limbs clawing the darkening sky, and the air was so cold it bit into the lungs with every breath. The power had flickered once just after nightfall in Nate Callahan's cabin, but when it cut out entirely an hour later, it did so with a finality that silenced even the wind. The place sank into a kind of quiet too complete to be accidental. Nate had known for days that something was coming. It was there, in the way the white SUV lingered too long at the edge of the woods. It lived in the patterns of the footprints found just beyond the tree line, where no one should have been walking. But tonight that knowing turned into fact, and when Ash, curled beside the fireplace with his ears tilted back, suddenly stood and moved toward the door with a low, guttural growl vibrating from deep in his chest, the old ranger moved too. He didn't panic. Instead, he opened the small cabinet beside the hearth and took out the shotgun he hadn't used in years. The metal was cold against his palm, but the weight was familiar. He checked the shells by touch alone and moved quietly across the floor, past the small cot where Ella lay sleeping. Her breath came in soft rhythms, uneven and full of the residue of dreams. She had been recovering since Ash brought her home, still weak, still carrying a quietness that hadn't been there before. Nate hated that quiet. It meant something had cracked and hadn't healed. Outside, the forest had gone still, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm or something worse. Nate moved to the front door, but didn't open it. Instead, he crouched and waited. Ash remained beside him, ears forward, tail stiff, eyes burning gold in the dark. The silence stretched, then it broke. From the woods beyond the cabin, 3 figures emerged. They moved without flashlights, dressed in dark clothing, their steps deliberate and quiet. They did not carry the awkward tension of people lost in the dark. These men knew exactly where they were going. The lead figure lifted a hand, signaling the others to split off. Nate saw the glint of metal as one of them adjusted something slung over his shoulder. Not hunters, not hikers, professionals. Ash surged forward before Nate could stop him, crashing through the door and into the snow with a flash of black muscle and teeth. His growl rose into a savage snarl as he launched toward the nearest intruder. The man raised an arm, but Ash hit him before he could react fully. They went down together, a tangle of fur and limbs, and then the wolf was on his feet again, turning toward the next target. Gunfire erupted, sharp and brutal against the quiet. Nate swung the shotgun around and fired once, striking one of the men low in the leg. He dropped with a cry, writhing in the snow. The third assailant retreated toward the trees, but not before firing blindly toward the cabin. Glass shattered as a bullet punched through the front window, sending shards across the room. Ella screamed from inside, the sound ragged and terrified, but Nate had no time to comfort her. He chambered another round. Ash, bleeding from a gash along his shoulder, didn't slow. He drove the second man back toward the tree line, forcing him into a retreat. The man raised his weapon again, but before he could fire, Ash lunged, his jaws clamping down on the man's wrist with a crack of bone. The scream that followed was short-lived. The man dropped his gun, collapsed, and didn't rise. Nate moved quickly to the man he had shot in the leg, keeping his shotgun trained as he approached. The man, groaning and trying to reach for something inside his coat, froze when Nate barked a warning. With practiced ease, the old ranger kicked the weapon away and rolled the man onto his stomach. A set of zip ties from the utility drawer was enough to hold him until help arrived. Ash returned, limping but alert, his eyes scanning the darkness. Blood coated his flank, but he remained upright, standing between Nate and the woods, body rigid and ready. The night had turned from silent to savage in moments, and now all that remained was the brittle hush of aftermath. Sheriff Marn Bowen arrived 20 minutes later, siren silent, headlights off. Nate had called her directly using the old satellite line in the shed, bypassing the local dispatch entirely. He didn't want this to hit the open channels until they understood what they were dealing with. Bowen stepped from the cruiser with the sidearm drawn, eyes sweeping the tree line. 2 down, Nate said quietly. One's tied up in the back, the other's not going anywhere. Bowen knelt by the injured man, her flashlight catching a glimpse of a tattoo on the man's forearm, something Nate didn't recognize, but her expression darkened. This one's not local, she muttered. I'll call it in to the feds. There was a pause then. Well, I'll be damned. Thought you dropped off the map. Luke looked at the wolf resting beside the wood stove, chest rising slow, eyes half closed but alert. Need a favor? Quiet kind about a ghost who came back. He didn't say the name. He didn't need to. Delaney would understand. Some stories didn't. Start over. They just waited until the right page turned again. And for the first time in 3 years, Luke Granger felt that old familiar stillness, the one that came not before violence, but after knowing it was already on the way. Ash stirred, stood, walked to the door, and sat, ears raised, gaze fixed outward like he could already hear the storm that hadn't yet arrived. The morning that followed the siege arrived not with peace, but with a tense stillness that clung to the air like dust after a rock slide. The forest remained quiet, as if holding its breath in the aftermath of violence. At Nate Callahan's cabin, broken glass still littered the ground outside, footprints and blood smudges marking the porch where the fight had ended just hours earlier. Inside, the air was thick with the remnants of gunpowder, fear, and something heavier, the weight of truths long buried. Ash lay curled beside the wood stove, his flank wrapped in gauze and padded cloth that Nate had applied with careful, trembling hands. The wolf's breathing was shallow but steady, his eyes half-lidded but alert. Ella sat near him, her knees drawn to her chest, a blanket draped around her shoulders. She had not spoken much since the attack, but her eyes never left the wolf. She understood something wordless had passed between them that night, something unbreakable. After the police took the captured intruder away, Nate had stayed up with Ash, his old medic training from his ranger days kicking in as he tried to stop the bleeding. The vet from the nearby town would come later, but it was Nate who had kept the animal alive in those first critical hours. And while he worked, something in his mind kept circling the same thought. The name, Kellen Rohr. That name hadn't been uttered around Clearwater Ridge in years. It was one of those names that showed up in half-redacted files, in rumors passed through retired channels, and in projects that no one officially admitted to. The man who had run shadow programs for government contracts, the kind of missions, meant to disappear along with everyone involved. Nate had seen the documents before, back when he had clearance, and the mention of Kellen Rohr always meant two things: control and silence. And now he knew without question that Ash had been part of one of those programs, a weapon built and discarded, a ghost in the system. As the sun climbed through the treetops, Nate took the old satellite phone from the drawer beneath the floorboards. It hadn't been used in years, and the battery blinked red with protest, but it connected. He called someone he hadn't spoken to since he left the Ranger Corps, someone who still had enough pull to dig through the kind of files that didn't show up in civilian databases. 2 hours later, Nate had the answer. Ash had once been designated Asset 042A, a part of a covert program known as WARD, Wilderness Adaptive Reconnaissance Division. Rohr had overseen the training of hybrid rescue animals enhanced for infiltration, detection, and extraction. Ash had been the most advanced, emotionally attuned, highly responsive, fiercely loyal, until something had gone wrong. On a mission in northern Utah, Ash had refused a command. Reports labeled it as a failure of programming. But what the documents described in code, Nate could read in subtext. Ash had chosen to protect a civilian instead of executing a target. He had disobeyed an order because he knew it was wrong. After that, the program had shut down quietly, and Ash had been marked for termination. But instead of putting a bullet in him, they had caged him, tested him, and when the fire at Clearwater broke out during a routine relocation, they left him to die. The records listed him as destroyed in the fire, but he hadn't died. He had vanished into the wild, carrying the burned scars and a memory no one had bothered to erase. Nate closed the file, the screen flickering as the phone's battery gave out. He didn't need to see more. He knew what had to come next. That night, under a sky stretched tight with clouds, Nate, Ella, and Ash set out. The sheriff had offered to place them in protective custody, but Nate had refused. He knew that waiting to be hunted again would only end in more bloodshed. If they wanted this over, they would have to take it to the source. Through contacts who owed Nate old favors, they traced Kellen Rohr's current location to an abandoned shipping yard on the outskirts of Marlow Creek, a place where derelict buildings leaned like forgotten memories, and rusted machinery echoed with ghosts of past utility. It had once been a logistics hub during the mining boom. Now it served a quieter, darker purpose. Nate drove through the night in his battered Jeep. Ella tucked safely in the back seat, bundled in layers of flannel and denim, her hands clutching Ash's fur for reassurance. The wolf sat with his head low, but eyes sharp, alert to every shift in wind and every rustle of movement outside the vehicle. They arrived just before dawn, mist crawling across the lot like the breath of something ancient. Nate pulled into the shadows behind a half-collapsed hangar and shut off the engine. He turned to Ella, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You stay here," he said, his voice low but firm. "No matter what happens, Ash and I will go in." But Ella shook her head, her eyes wide but steady. "He came for me. I'm not leaving him." Nate hesitated, but the resolve in her gaze reminded him of someone else he once knew, someone who didn't back down when the world turned cruel. He handed her a flashlight and a whistle. "If something goes wrong, run for the woods and blow this. Someone will come." She nodded, and Nate stepped out into the fog with Ash at his side. Inside the largest warehouse, a low hum of generators vibrated through the concrete. Crates were stacked against the walls, and half-covered equipment hinted at ongoing operations. At the center stood a man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, posture straight as a blade, Kellen Rohr. He turned as Nate stepped into view, a smirk curling his lips. "I wondered when you'd show," Rohr said, hands folded behind his back. "Didn't expect you to bring my old project with you." Ash growled low, the sound like gravel being ground beneath boot heels. "You did all this for control," Nate said, stepping forward. "You used him, then tried to erase him." Rohr shrugged. "He was never meant to feel loyalty. He was meant to obey. He's not a tool," Nate snapped. "He's not yours anymore." In that moment, one of Rohr's men moved from the shadows, weapon raised. But Ash lunged before the man could aim, teeth flashing, body a blur of motion. A shot rang out, missed, and the warehouse erupted into chaos. Ash held nothing back. He moved, with terrifying precision. The training that had once made him a ghost among shadows now wielded with purpose and fury. Nate returned fire, covering Ash's flank, forcing the remaining guards to retreat deeper into the maze of crates. Rohr tried to escape through a side exit, but Ella, who had followed against orders, stood in his path, flashlight beam aimed steady. Rohr froze just long enough for Ash to arrive behind him, low and silent. The man didn't move. He had seen the wolf's eyes and knew that mercy would not be offered twice. They didn't need to kill him. He was still breathing when the local authorities arrived, drawn by the earlier whistle Ella had blown when she realized Nate was outnumbered. Backup came in waves, but it was over by then. Ash stood in the center of the yard, chest heaving, burn mark glinting beneath the rising sun. Ella ran to him and buried her face in his fur. He did not flinch. Weeks later, when everything had been documented, when Rohr was indicted and the remnants of the Ward D program exposed, Ella made a formal request through a local wildlife foundation. It took some time, but eventually the answer came. Ash could stay, not in a cage, not as a project, but as a companion. She signed the papers with hands still bearing faint scars from the zip ties, a reminder of where it had all started. Nate stood beside her as the ink dried. Ash sat at their feet watching the woods beyond the porch. He would always be marked by what had been done to him. But now he was no longer hunted, no longer alone. And when the wind swept through Clearwater Ridge, sometimes at night, a long, low howl would echo through the trees, not of fear, but of home.